Alright everybody, welcome back to another Pro Tools tutorial video. What I wanted to show you here is the concept of submixing. So submixing dives into the whole world of signal routing in Pro Tools, sending signals to various locations in the mix window and among the tracks. Think of this as if you were using a physical mixer. If you want to send signal from one track to another, if you were in an analog studio and you wanted to send, track data, audio signal from, let's say, the kick drum into a compression plugin that's in a physical rack, that's what you would do. You would use different signal routing processes, and submixing is a process that's really useful for adding another perspective when you're level balancing and you're mixing. All right, so let me show you what I mean. So right now we have all the individual tracks. We have a master fader, right, that shows us all the tracks grouped together, and then individual faders and level monitors on the individual tracks. One thing we can do is we can create groups, right? If we go over to this track list area, hit new group or Command G, we can create different mixing groups that control the faders, all the different parameters that we find on the tracks for whatever instruments are in the group. I can create a, drum set group, I can create vocal group, guitar group, etc., etc. This is fine. This is fine for, making quick mixing decisions, panning, all this stuff. But I personally like to use submixing because it gives me another stage in between adjusting individual tracks and adjusting the master fader track. It's very similar to grouping, but it just creates a section as it would, to resemble a mixer. All right, so I'll show you how to do that. Okie dokes. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create some auxiliary tracks. Let's see what we have going on. I will create, let's say, a drum kit group or submix, something for electric guitars. We'll do keys and vocals. Stereo, auxiliary tracks. And we can just create 4. I'll just go from here and I'll rename them in the mix window. All right, so this creates 4 different auxiliary tracks. I like to have them just before the master fader. I'm going to move this reference track under the master fader. All right, this is similar to the layout in a physical mixer. You'd have your submixes or subgroups right next to the master fader, because generally when you're mixing on a mixer, in terms of signal routing, you would send your audio signals to the submix and you'd send the submix to the master fader. So that's what I have here. So let me label these drums. So what we're going to do now is we are going to use our input and output system to send signal from all these different tracks into this stereo submix tracks, the different ones for the different tracks. All right, so here's the gist. Like I said before, I want to create a submix for my drum kit, something that groups all the drum kit elements together, so that way I can raise the volume of the drum kit up and down holistically. Let's say I'm in my mix and I'm like, oh, everything's really balanced among the different drum parts here, but in the mix as a whole, I wish the drums were more prominent. So submixing gives me that in-between stage that's really helpful, right? So what I am going to do is I'm going to take the output, because I'm going to do direct in and out to the submix. I'm taking the output of my various drum tracks and I'm going to go in to, let me go over here. I'm going to go in to my submix that I set up for the drums. So let me give you an example. All right, output, and there's a couple things you can do. You can go directly into the drum aux that you just created, which is fine. It's direct. You could also create a bus. A bus is essentially a routing protocol that lets you put signal into almost like a bus for school children and send that signal out to different parts of your mixer or, effects processors. You can even see up here we have the sends. The purpose of that is to send your signal to other parts of the mixer. All right, so let's do it this way. We'll keep it simple. I'll put this in the drums, all right, the auxiliary track that we just created. And then look here, input is drums. So now if we press play, that track that I just loaded in is now going to the drum submix. Now, one thing to be mindful of, once you start adding tracks to a submix, when you hit solo, you also have to solo the submix, because otherwise you're not going to hear anything. This is because you're sending the output of that particular track directly into the submix. When you use these sends up here, you're making a copy of the signal and then sending it elsewhere. When you route from down here, you're essentially taking the direct output and putting it directly into another input source. All right? So just be mindful that if you just only solo the kick track, for instance, that you're not going to hear anything. You have to also solo the submix. So this is why it's important to get more familiar with signal routing, because you're going to sometimes say, what's wrong with my audio? Like, why isn't this working? And then you have this aha moment like, oh, I forgot to solo the submix too. All right, so what I'm going to do is add the rest of the drum tracks to the submix now. All right, so I just spent some time adding all of the drum parts into the submix. So let's take a little listen how this now sounds together. Very interesting, right? But notice we just have the drum submix now. And so this is really helpful, so that way if I feel like it's just the drum kit that's low in general, holistically, I can raise this volume, or I could lower it in the mix. All right. So I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to basically add the groups, add the individual tracks into all the subgroups I created. Just as a little reminder, I'll show you how I did the signal routing one more time. And in fact, let me show you how to use the buses, so that way you also have an example of that. All right, so let's do this with the electric guitar. I'm going to go from the output, and I'm going to go to bus, because remember, a bus is going to send our audio signal, just like we send school children to school using a bus, right? It's going to put it on a track that I can then send to another source. One advantage of putting the signal on a bus is that since you're putting it on this bus source, you can actually route it to various signal paths. So I could, for instance, route the this guitar here not only to the guitar bus, the guitar auxiliary track submix, but I could also route it to a track that just has reverb, and I could route it to a separate compression track too. And I can do all of these things because I'm not sending one singular direct copy to another track like I did with the drum submixing. I'm putting it on a bus, and then I can send that signal to multiple places using the bus. All right, so let me use a bus, and I will use bus 1 and 2. Okay, so I'm setting that as the output, And now I'm going to set, let's see, bus 1 and 2, that same one that I'm sending the guitar on. I'm going to set that as the input for this track. And notice the output for the submix is going to our general stereo output. All right, so we successfully bussed the signal over into the guitar submix track. So what I'm gonna do for the time being, and I'll cut this out, I'm going to just finish off all the bussing into the different submixes. All right, so I just finished routing all of my individual tracks into the submixes. So let's just check out how this is. What I'll do is I'll play it, I'll solo and I'll mute some things, just so we can hear how much control now we have at this middle level of our mix. Oh, okay. If I do that, I have to make sure I also solo the other tracks in the group. But if I mute, so it's a little easier to mute rather than solo things, because you have everything into these larger groups. You have everything organized into these larger groups. But notice now how I can affect the overall balance. So again, let's go with the example of, I feel like the drums could really come out more. Right, so this gives me a much more nuanced stage of mixing, and this is really helpful too, because after you completed your rough mix, you generally have your balance where you want it to be, right? You always have to make adjustments based on effects and different processes that you apply, but this gives you a way of not having to make so many individual adjustments. If it's not necessary, you can make this broader middle level adjustment. In general, we do not want to touch the master fader. We want to keep that at 0, so we have a nice balanced perspective. We're not boosting the faders. So this gives you kind of a zoomed out approach and perspective to mixing. And mixing overall, I think that's one of the most important parts of mixing. It's just doing it with multiple perspectives. Right? So that's the gist of submixing and signal routing. So the more comfortable you get with that, the more efficient your workflow will be. All right, see you guys next video.